discovered my guardians left me nothing in their will while my cousin got everything. So I stopped covering their expenses. Weeks later, Aunt texted, "The utilities are due." No hello, no small talk. I simply responded by doing this instead. I, 29M, thought I knew what family meant until 3 weeks ago when everything I believed about love, loyalty, and blood ties crumbled in a single afternoon. My parents died when I was 8 in a car accident that left me with nothing but nightmares and a social worker who explained that my aunt and uncle would be taking me in. They weren't wealthy people. My uncle worked construction, my aunt cleaned houses, but they opened their home to me without hesitation. For 21 years, I called them mom and dad, slept under their roof, ate at their table, and genuinely believed I was their son in every way that mattered. When I turned 18, I started working part-time while finishing high school, contributing what I could to household expenses. After graduation, I landed a decent job in IT support, and by 25, I was making good money. That's when I started covering more of their bills. The mortgage payments when my uncle's back injury kept him out of work for months. The medical bills when my aunt needed surgery. The car repairs, the home maintenance, the groceries. I handled it all because that's what family does, right? My cousin Jake, their biological son, was 2 years younger than me. While I was working overtime to keep the family afloat, Jake was pursuing his passion for art, bouncing between part-time jobs and creative projects that never quite paid the bills. I never resented him for it. Everyone has their path, and I was happy to be the stable one, the provider, the responsible son who made sure the lights stayed on. 3 weeks ago, my uncle passed away suddenly from a heart attack. The funeral was devastating, but we pulled together as a family. My aunt was inconsolable. Jake was struggling with his grief, and I found myself handling all the arrangements while managing my own sorrow. I took time off work, paid for the funeral expenses, and made sure my aunt had everything she needed during those first terrible days. A week after the funeral, my aunt asked me to come over to discuss some important matters. I assumed she wanted to talk about finances, maybe how we'd manage the household expenses going forward. I was already mentally calculating how much more I could contribute to help her through this transition. Instead, she sat me down at the kitchen table where I'd done homework as a kid, where we'd shared thousands of meals, and handed me a copy of my uncle's will. The document was straightforward and brutal in its simplicity. The house, the life insurance payout, the savings account, the truck, everything went to Jake. Every single asset, every dollar, every possession accumulated over decades of marriage was left to their biological son. My name appeared exactly once in the entire document, in a section that specifically stated I was to receive nothing. I sat there staring at the papers, reading the same lines over and over, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. My aunt watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not apologetic, not sad, just expectant. When I finally looked up, she explained that they'd always planned it this way. Jake was their real son, their blood, and it was only natural that he inherit everything. She said it matter-of-factly, as if she were explaining why the sky was blue or why water was wet. She added that they'd given me a home and raised me, and that should be enough. They'd done their duty. I asked about the years of financial support, the mortgage payments, the medical bills, the countless times I'd stepped in when money was tight. She waved it off, saying that was just me helping family, and family helps each other. But apparently, that obligation only flowed in one direction. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. I folded the will, handed it back to her, and told her I needed time to process everything. She nodded and mentioned that Jake would probably want to move back into the house soon, so I should start thinking about finding my own place. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. I drove home to my apartment, the small, modest place I'd kept even while essentially supporting their household, and sat in my car for an hour, trying to understand how I'd been so completely wrong about everything. The people I'd called mom and dad for over 2 decades had never seen me as anything more than a convenient source of income with an expiration date. That night, I made a decision that felt both devastating and liberating. I opened my laptop and began canceling every automatic payment, every recurring transfer, every financial connection I had to their household. The mortgage payment scheduled for the following week, canceled. The utility bills that came out of my account monthly, canceled. The insurance premiums, the phone bill, the streaming services, The grocery budget I supplemented, all of it, gone. I didn't call to explain or announce my decision. They'd made their position clear, and I was simply accepting it. If I wasn't family enough to inherit, I wasn't family enough to support. The first week passed quietly. I threw myself into work, picked up extra projects, and started researching investment opportunities for all the money I was no longer sending their way. It was remarkable how much disposable income one had when I wasn't covering someone else's living expenses. The second week, Jake moved back into the house. I heard this through mutual friends, not from my aunt directly. Apparently, he was excited about having his childhood room back and was planning to convert the garage into an art studio. I wondered if he knew about the mortgage payment that was now his responsibility or the utility bills that would start arriving in his name. By the third week, reality began setting in for them. Jake's part-time income from his art sales and occasional freelance work wasn't enough to cover the basic household expenses, let alone the mortgage on a house that was now worth considerably more than when they'd bought it 20 years ago. My aunt's cleaning business provided some income, but without my contributions, they were facing a significant shortfall. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message that perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with the situation. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the weeks of silence, no recognition that anything had changed between us. Just 5 words that assumed I was still their personal ATM. The utilities are due. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling a mixture of anger and something that might have been relief. Here was proof, in stark black and white, of exactly how they saw me. Not as a son, not as family, but as a financial resource to be activated when needed. I could have responded with anger, could have sent a long message explaining how hurt and betrayed I felt. I could have detailed every sacrifice I'd made, every bill I'd paid, every time I'd chosen their needs over my own wants. But that would have given them ammunition to paint me as the ungrateful adopted child who turned his back on the people who raised him. Instead, I took a screenshot of their text message and posted it on social media with a simple caption explaining that this was how my guardians contacted me after leaving me nothing in their will while giving everything to their biological son. I didn't name them, didn't include identifying details, just shared the raw truth of how they saw our relationship. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Friends, coworkers, and extended family members who'd watched me support my guardians for years began sharing their own thoughts. Many expressed shock at the casual entitlement of that text message. Others shared similar stories of being taken advantage of by family members who confused love with financial obligation. Within hours, the post had been shared dozens of times. People were commenting with their own experiences, offering support, and expressing outrage at the situation. Several mutual friends reached out privately to tell me they'd always wondered about the dynamic in that household, how I seemed to be carrying an unfair financial burden while Jake pursued his artistic dreams. But the real impact came when some of these mutual friends started asking my aunt and Jake directly about the situation. Suddenly, they were facing questions from their community about why they'd cut their adopted son out of the will while continuing to expect his financial support. The narrative they'd probably planned to control, the ungrateful adopted child who abandoned his family, was being challenged by people who'd witnessed years of my contributions. My aunt called me that evening, her voice tight with anger. She demanded I take down the post, claiming I was embarrassing the family and making them look bad. I told her that I hadn't said anything untrue, hadn't revealed their names or personal details, just shared exactly what they'd sent me. If they looked bad, it was because their actions looked bad when exposed to daylight. She tried to guilt me, reminding me of everything they'd done for me as a child, how they'd taken me in when no one else would. I acknowledged that they'd provided for me when I was young and unable to provide for myself, just as I'd provided for them when they were struggling and unable to manage alone. The difference was that I'd never expected them to continue supporting me indefinitely, while they'd apparently always planned to continue expecting my support indefinitely. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me, but not before she mentioned that Jake was stressed about the mortgage payment and maybe we could work something out. Even in her anger, even after being publicly embarrassed, she was still trying to figure out how to get my money. Over the following days, the social media post continued to gain traction. It had struck a nerve with people who'd experienced similar family dynamics, who'd been the responsible ones carrying others who never appreciated the sacrifice. The comments section became a support group for people sharing their own stories of financial exploitation disguised as family obligation. Jake finally reached out to me directly, asking if we could meet for coffee to talk things through. His approach was different from his mother's, less demanding, more conciliatory. He admitted he hadn't fully understood how much I'd been contributing to the household over the years, and he was feeling overwhelmed by the financial responsibilities he'd inherited along with the assets. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop where we used to hang out as teenagers. He looked tired and stressed, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the old protective instinct I'd always had toward him. But then he started talking about how we could restructure things. Maybe I could help with just the mortgage while he got on his feet, or perhaps we could work out some kind of loan arrangement. I realized he still didn't understand the fundamental issue. This wasn't about money. It was about respect, recognition, and the basic acknowledgement that family relationships should be reciprocal. They'd made it clear that I wasn't really family, just a convenient source of support. I couldn't go back to that dynamic, even if they were willing to throw me a few scraps of inheritance to keep the money flowing. I explained to Jake that I wasn't angry about the will itself. Parents have the right to leave their assets to whomever they choose, and I understood the logic of biological children inheriting from their parents. What I couldn't accept was the expectation that I would continue providing financial support while being explicitly excluded from the family in legal terms. He tried to argue that the will was just paperwork, that I was still family in all the ways that mattered. But if that were true, I pointed out, they wouldn't have sent me a demand for utility money without any acknowledgement of the changed circumstances. They would have had a conversation about how we could all adjust to the new reality together. The meeting ended with Jake asking me to think about it, to consider that his mother was grieving and maybe hadn't handled things well. I told him I'd already thought about it extensively, and my decision was final. I wished him well with his inheritance and his new responsibilities, but I was done being their safety net. The social media post eventually ran its course, but the impact lingered. Several people in their social circle had seen it and drawn their own conclusions about the family dynamics. My aunt found herself having to explain to neighbors and friends why her adopted son was no longer helping with expenses, and the explanations apparently weren't landing well with everyone. More importantly, I'd found my own peace with the situation. The money I'd been sending them was now going into investments and savings for my own future. I was sleeping better, feeling less stressed about finances, and beginning to build relationships that were based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. A month after that first text about the utilities, I received another message from my aunt. This one was longer, more carefully crafted. She apologized for how she'd handled the will discussion, acknowledged that I'd been generous over the years, and suggested we could all sit down and work out a new arrangement that would be fair to everyone. But it was too late for that. The damage wasn't in the will or even in the expectation of continued support. The damage was in that casual, entitled text message that revealed exactly how they saw me, not as a person with feelings and dignity, but as a resource to be tapped when needed. I didn't respond to her apology text. Instead, I blocked both their numbers and focused on building the life I wanted rather than the life they expected me to fund. Sometimes the most powerful response to being taken for granted is simply refusing to be available for granted anymore. The house went into foreclosure 3 months later. Jake had found a buyer interested in his art, but not at prices that could cover mortgage payments. My aunt's cleaning business wasn't enough to make up the difference, and their attempts to find another family member willing to step into my role had been unsuccessful. I heard about the foreclosure through mutual friends, and I felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness for the end of what had been my childhood home, relief that I wasn't being dragged down with their financial struggles, and a strange sense of vindication that my contributions had been more significant than they'd ever acknowledged. They eventually found a smaller rental property and downsized significantly. Jake got a full-time job to supplement his art income, and my aunt took on additional cleaning clients. They were managing, but just barely, and the comfortable lifestyle they'd maintained with my help was gone. I never gloated about their struggles or felt satisfaction in their difficulties, but I also never doubted that I'd made the right choice. They'd taught me an important lesson about the difference between being family and being used by family, and I was grateful to have learned it before wasting any more years of my life. The experience changed how I approach all my relationships now. I'm more careful about establishing boundaries, more aware of when generosity crosses the line into enabling, and more willing to walk away from people who see me as a resource rather than a person. Sometimes people ask if I regret cutting them off, if I miss having that family connection. The truth is, I miss the family I thought I had, but I don't miss the reality of what that relationship actually was. Real family doesn't send demanding texts about utility bills after excluding you from their will. Real family doesn't take 20 years of financial support for granted while planning to leave you with nothing. I'm building new relationships now, chosen family based on mutual respect and genuine care. It's smaller than what I had before, but it's real in a way that my old family never was. And when these people need help, I'm happy to provide it, because I know they see me as more than just a convenient source of money. The last I heard, my aunt and Jake were doing okay in their new circumstances. They'd adjusted to their actual income level and were managing their expenses without external support. It was probably good for both of them to experience financial independence, even if the transition had been difficult. As for me, I'm thriving in ways I never expected. Without the constant drain of supporting another household, I've been able to invest in my own future, pursue interests I'd put on hold, and build relationships with people who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide. That text message about the utilities being due turned out to be a gift, though not the kind they intended. It showed me exactly where I stood in their lives and gave me the clarity I needed to make a clean break. Sometimes the most honest communication comes in the form of casual cruelty, and I'm grateful I finally heard the message they'd been sending all along.